The first time I saw a real panic on my husband's face was inside a quiet courtroom in DuPage County, Illinois. Daniel had just finished signing the divorce papers. He leaned back in his chair like a man who had finally won something. His lawyer slid the document across the table, glanced down at the last page, and suddenly stopped talking. For a moment, the room went strangely quiet. Then his lawyer leaned closer and whispered something to him. I couldn't hear the exact words, but I saw the change immediately. Daniel's confident smile faded. His eyes dropped back to the paperwork. He started flipping through the pages like he was looking for something he should have noticed earlier. That was the moment my husband realized that taking everything in the divorce didn't mean what he thought it meant. But the story didn't start in that courtroom. It started years earlier in a very normal house in Naperville, Illinois, in a very normal marriage that most people would have called stable. For nearly 20 years, Daniel and I built our life the way a lot of American couples do. We worked hard. We paid our bills. We raised our son, Ethan. On the outside, it looked simple. Daniel ran a construction company called Lawson Urban Development. He started it when we were still in our 20s. Back then, it was just him, an old pickup truck, and a couple of small renovation jobs around the Chicago suburbs. I handled the paperwork in the beginning. Invoices, scheduling phone calls with clients. The unglamorous stuff that keeps a small business alive. Daniel liked to say he built the company from the ground up. Technically, that was true. But I always knew I had poured just as many late nights into it as he had. Over time, the business grew. Bigger projects, more employees, new trucks parked in front of the house. Eventually, Daniel rented a real office space about 15 minutes from home. By the time Ethan was in middle school, things looked pretty comfortable. We had a 4-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone waves when they walk their dogs in the evening. Daniel drove a black pickup that cost more than our first home together. I drove a sensible SUV because I was usually the one hauling sports gear and groceries. We weren't flashy people, but life felt steady. That's probably why it took me longer than it should have to notice the small changes. At first, it was just Daniel working later than usual. Construction schedules can get messy, so that didn't seem strange. But then the late nights started happening almost every week. Then his phone started staying face down on the kitchen counter. Then the passcode changed. When you've been married long enough, you notice those things even if you pretend not to. One evening I asked him about it while we were cleaning up after dinner. Busy season, I said casually. Daniel barely looked up from his phone. Yeah, a couple projects running behind. That answer should have made sense. But something about the way he said it felt rehearsed. Around the same time, the business finances started shifting in ways that didn't match the story he was telling. I still handled some of the bookkeeping from home, mostly because I had done it for years and no one had ever officially replaced me. That meant bank statements still landed in our shared email. One afternoon, I opened one without thinking much about it. At first, everything looked normal. Then I noticed the credit line. It was much higher than I remembered. A lot higher. I stared at the screen for a while, trying to remember if Daniel had mentioned expanding the company's financing. He hadn't. Later that night, I brought it up while we were watching television. Did the bank increase the company credit line? Daniel didn't answer right away. He grabbed the remote, lowered the volume, and said, "Yeah, just business stuff." That was it. No explanation. Just business stuff. The strange part wasn't the credit line itself. Construction companies use financing all the time. The strange part was how quickly Daniel wanted the conversation to end. And once I started paying attention, the details didn't stop there. I kept staring at that number on the screen, wondering why Daniel hadn't mentioned the credit increase. At first, I told myself it probably meant the business was growing. Construction companies expand their credit lines when they take on bigger projects. That was a normal explanation, and for a few days I tried to leave it at that. But the strange part wasn't the credit line itself. It was Daniel. For most of our marriage, Daniel loved talking about the company. New contracts, difficult clients, delayed permits. I heard about all of it whether I wanted to or not. Running a small construction company meant the job followed him home every night. Except now, it didn't. When I asked simple questions, the answers got shorter. Busy day. Yeah. New project. Just some remodel stuff. That was about as detailed as the conversations went. It didn't make sense because I had been part of that business from the beginning. Back when Lawson Urban Development was just a name Daniel printed on business cards at the local office supply store. In those early years, our kitchen table doubled as the company office. I handled invoices while Daniel returned phone calls to contractors. Sometimes we worked past midnight because a client wanted a quote by the next morning. We were young, broke, and stubborn enough to think we could build something from nothing. And for a long time it worked. Daniel was good at winning projects. He knew how to talk to property developers and real estate investors. He could walk onto a construction site, look around for 5 minutes, and immediately understand what needed to happen. I handled the details that kept everything running. Payments, schedules, permits, subcontractor paperwork. The things no one notices until they stop getting done. When Ethan was born, I stepped back a little from the daily work, but the financial side of the company still ran through me. Daniel trusted me with the numbers mostly because I had been managing them since the first day. That's why the changes started bothering me. Not because something huge had happened overnight, but because small habits were disappearing. Daniel used to leave folders from the office on the kitchen counter. Estimates, project timelines, invoices waiting to be approved. Now those folders stayed in his truck. He used to complain about subcontractors who missed deadlines. Now he didn't mention them at all. Even the way he talked about work felt different, like he was carefully staying away from details. One night while we were getting ready for bed, I asked him about a project I remembered from a few weeks earlier. The townhouse renovation on Maple Street, I said. Did that close yet? Daniel paused for a second while he plugged his phone into the charger. Yeah, pretty much done. That answer surprised me. Already, I asked. That was supposed to take another month. He shrugged. Things moved faster. Then he climbed into bed and turned off the light. That should have been the end of the conversation, but the timeline didn't match the invoices I had seen earlier that week. According to the payment schedule, the project hadn't even reached the halfway point. Lying there in the dark, I tried to convince myself I was overthinking it. Construction timelines change all the time. Permits get approved early. Contractors work faster than expected. Still, the explanation didn't feel right. And once that thought settled in, other things started standing out. Daniel's phone buzzed more often during dinner. Sometimes he would glance at the screen and flip the phone over before replying. Other times, he would pick it up and step into the hallway like he needed privacy for a 2-sentence conversation. I didn't accuse him of anything. After nearly 20 years of marriage, jumping to conclusions felt ridiculous. But I started paying attention. Little things at first. How late he stayed at the office. Whether he mentioned the same coworkers he used to talk about. Which projects he discussed, and which ones he avoided. And the more I watched, the clearer one detail became. Daniel wasn't just working late. He was making sure I didn't see what he was doing during the day. That was the moment I stopped assuming I was imagining things. Once you start paying attention inside your own marriage, the pattern either disappears or it becomes impossible to ignore. In my case, the pattern got louder. Daniel started leaving the house earlier than usual. For years, his routine had been predictable. Coffee at 7 o'clock, out the door around 7:45, office by 8:15. Now he was gone before I even finished pouring my coffee. The first morning it happened, I walked into the kitchen and noticed his truck was already gone. No coffee mug in the sink, no laptop bag on the chair. Just silence. When I asked about it that evening, he gave another quick answer. Early site meeting. That explanation sounded reasonable. Construction crews start early. But then it happened again 2 days later. And again the following week. The bigger change, though, was his phone. For most of our marriage, Daniel treated his phone like a tool. It sat on the counter in the truck on the living room table. Anyone could pick it up to check the weather or answer a call. Now it never left his pocket. If he went to the garage, the phone went with him. If he stepped outside to take a call, the phone went with him. If he went to the bathroom, the phone definitely went with him. One evening, Ethan noticed it too. Our son was home from college for the weekend, sitting at the kitchen island while Daniel grilled burgers outside. Ethan reached for the phone on the counter when it buzzed. I saw Daniel step through the back door faster than I'd ever seen him move for a text message. "I got it," he said quickly, grabbing the phone. Ethan raised an eyebrow and looked at me. "Top secret construction business," Daniel forced a laugh. "Clients get weird about response time." It sounded like a joke, but the tension stayed in the room for the rest of dinner. A few days later, something else happened that didn't match the story Daniel kept repeating. I was running errands in downtown Naperville when I decided to stop by the company office. It had been a while since I'd gone there, and I figured I'd drop off some paperwork. Lawson Urban Development rented a small office on the second floor of a brick building near Washington Street. Nothing fancy. Just a couple desks, a conference table, and a storage room for blueprints. When I walked in, the receptionist looked surprised. "Rebecca, hi." "Hey," I said, holding up the folder. "Just bringing a few documents for Daniel." She hesitated. "Oh, he's not here today." That caught me off guard. "Not here." She shook her head. "He left earlier. I checked the time on my phone. It was barely past noon." "That's strange," I said. "He told me he had meetings all day." The receptionist shifted uncomfortably. "Well, he did have a meeting this morning." "With who?" I asked casually. She glanced at the calendar on the desk. "Ashley, I think." The name didn't mean anything to me at the time. "New client?" "I'm not sure," she said. "She's been here a few times lately." I nodded like the answer made sense. But the second I walked back to my car, the details started sitting wrong in my head. A few times lately. Daniel hadn't mentioned any new clients named Ashley. And that afternoon when Daniel came home around 6, I watched carefully to see if he would bring it up on his own. He didn't. Instead, he dropped his keys on the counter and said the same thing he'd been saying for weeks. "Long day at the office." I nodded, pretending nothing felt strange. But by that point, two things were becoming very clear. First, Daniel was lying about where he spent his time. And second, whoever Ashley was, she had already become part of his daily routine. I didn't ask Daniel about Ashley that night. Instead, I watched him. He sat at the kitchen island, eating leftovers, scrolling through his phone like nothing unusual had happened that day. Every once in a while, he smiled at something on the screen, then quickly locked the phone when he noticed me looking in his direction. If this had happened 10 years earlier, I might have confronted him right then. But after nearly 2 decades of marriage, I understood something about people. When someone is already lying, direct questions rarely produce honest answers. They just produce better lies. So I decided to do something else. I went back to the numbers. The next morning, after Daniel left the house before sunrise again, I opened my laptop at the dining table and logged into the business accounts. Technically, the company finances weren't my responsibility anymore. Daniel had hired an office manager 2 years earlier to handle most of the bookkeeping, but my name was still on the primary accounts. Old habits are hard to erase. At first, the statements looked ordinary. Payroll deposits, equipment payments, insurance, the kind of routine expenses you expect from a mid-sized construction company. Then I started looking at the credit line again. The balance was climbing faster than it should have been. Construction companies borrow money, but usually for materials tied to specific projects. Those purchases are easy to track because they match contracts and invoices. This didn't match anything I recognized. Large withdrawals were showing up without clear explanations. Transfers to subcontractors I didn't recognize. A couple payments labeled as consulting services. One of them was linked to a name I had never seen before, Ashley Parker. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen for a long time. The name from the office, the same one the receptionist mentioned. That didn't automatically mean anything inappropriate was happening. Plenty of consultants work with construction firms, design planners, real estate advisors, permitting specialists. But the payments felt irregular. too frequent, too round, the kind of numbers people choose when they don't want to explain details. Later that afternoon, I drove back to the office again. This time, I didn't go inside. Instead, I parked across the street where I could see the building entrance without being obvious. It felt strange sitting there watching the place my husband worked like I was some kind of private investigator. But curiosity is a powerful thing when trust starts cracking. Around 2 o'clock, Daniel's truck pulled into the parking lot. He stepped out talking on his phone, pacing beside the driver's door like the conversation mattered. A few minutes later, a silver sedan pulled up next to him. A woman stepped out. Mid-30s maybe. Dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, business casual clothes that looked more like a real estate agent than a contractor. Daniel's body language changed the second he saw her. He smiled, not the polite smile he used with clients, the relaxed kind. They stood close together while they talked, close enough that the conversation didn't look particularly professional. At one point, she touched his arm while laughing at something he said. I stayed in the car for another 20 minutes, watching them walk into the building together. No one who saw them from a distance would have assumed they were discussing construction permits. Driving home, I tried to stay logical. Maybe Ashley really was a consultant. Maybe the company had hired her for a project I simply didn't know about yet. But two things no longer fit the story Daniel kept repeating. First, he wasn't working late at the office most nights. And second, the money moving through the company accounts didn't look like normal business expenses anymore. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I realized something else. If Daniel was hiding both his time and his finances at the same time, there was only one way to figure out what was really happening. I needed someone who knew how to investigate problems like this without asking permission first. I sat in my car in the driveway for a while before going inside, staring at the house like it suddenly belonged to someone else. Nothing about it had changed. The same white siding, the same maple tree in the front yard, the same basketball hoop Ethan had used since middle school. But something inside the marriage had shifted, and I could feel it. I didn't confront Daniel that evening. Instead, I called someone I trusted. Her name was Linda Carver. We had met years earlier when her firm handled a contract dispute for one of Daniel's early construction projects. She was a family law attorney in Wheaton who had built a reputation for being calm, direct, and extremely hard to surprise. When she answered the phone, I kept the conversation simple. Linda. I need to ask you something, I said. Is this a business question or a marriage question? She replied. That told me she already sensed where the conversation might go. Both, I said. There was a short pause. Come by the office tomorrow, she said. Bring whatever financial records you have. The next afternoon, I sat across from her desk while she reviewed the documents I had printed from the company accounts. Linda didn't interrupt much while she read. Every once in a while, she circled a number with her pen or wrote a note in the margin. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. Okay, she said. Let's start with the obvious question. I waited. Do you think your husband is having an affair? Hearing the words out loud felt different from thinking them privately. I think something is going on, I said carefully. Linda nodded. That's usually the correct instinct. She tapped the paper where Ashley Parker's name appeared next to several payments. These transfers, she said. Do you know what services this person is providing? No. Has Daniel ever mentioned her? Not once. Linda looked at the documents again. Then we have two possibilities, she said calmly. Either this is legitimate consulting work that your husband never bothered to explain, or it's something else. What kind of something else, I asked. Affair partners sometimes receive money disguised as business expenses, she said. It happens more often than people realize. The sentence hung in the air for a moment. Then Linda added something I wasn't expecting. But that's not actually the part that concerns me the most. She turned the page to the credit line statement. Look at this balance. I had already seen the number dozens of times that week. It's high, I said. It's worse than high, Linda replied. It's accelerating. She pointed to the last 3 months of activity. The company had borrowed nearly $500,000 during that period. My stomach tightened. Daniel never mentioned any new projects that large. Exactly, Linda said. She flipped through the rest of the statements. Construction companies take loans when they need materials, labor, equipment. Those expenses usually match signed contracts. She looked back at me. I don't see those contracts here. What does that mean? I asked. It means either your husband is running a very unusual business strategy, or he's digging himself into debt. For the first time that afternoon, Linda's voice lost its casual tone. Rebecca, I need to ask something important. Okay. If Daniel asked for a divorce tomorrow, would you fight for half the company? The question caught me completely off guard. I guess so, I said. Isn't that normal? Linda didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed the folder and slid it back across the desk. Normally, yes, she said slowly. Then she added something that made the entire situation feel very different. But if these numbers are accurate, owning half that company might be the worst deal you could possibly accept. I sat there for a moment, trying to understand what Linda was saying. Worst deal, I asked. It's the company we built. Linda folded her hands on the desk. I know, she said calmly. But the company you built 20 years ago isn't necessarily the company that exists today. She turned the financial statements back toward me and tapped the credit line again. Businesses can hide problems for a long time, she continued, especially construction companies. Debt doesn't always show up in obvious ways until it's too late. I looked down at the numbers again. Are you saying the company is failing? I'm saying I don't see the kind of contracts that justify this level of borrowing. She leaned back in her chair. And if Daniel is using the business credit line irresponsibly, the debt belongs to the company. That still doesn't explain why I shouldn't fight for my share, I said. Linda gave a small, patient smile. Because in a divorce, assets and liabilities travel together. That sentence sat quietly between us. If you own half the company, she continued, you also own half the debt. My mind immediately started doing the math. $500,000. And that was just the borrowing I had already seen. Linda watched my expression carefully. You see the problem. I nodded slowly. So if we go through a typical divorce, I said I could walk away with half a business that's drowning in debt. Exactly. I stared at the documents again. For years, I had believed Lawson Urban Development was our safety net, the thing we had built together to protect our future. Now it looked more like a trap. What if Daniel files first, I asked. Linda shrugged. That depends on what he asks for. Let's say he wants the house, I said. Then the house becomes part of the negotiation. What about the company? That's where things get interesting. Linda opened a legal pad and started writing down a few quick notes. In most divorces, she said both sides fight over the assets. The house, the retirement accounts, the business. Everyone wants the biggest share possible. That sounds about right. But sometimes, she continued, the smartest move is to let the other person win the argument. I looked up. You mean, give it to him? Not exactly, she said. You let him believe he's winning. She slid the notepad across the desk. Think about this from Daniel's perspective. I read the notes she had written. House, business, vehicles, primary assets. If he believes the company is valuable, Linda said he's going to want full control of it. And if he takes it, then he also takes the responsibility tied to it. The idea felt strange at first. For years, the company had represented security, hard work, pride. Letting it go sounded like surrender. But the more I thought about the numbers on those statements, the more Linda's logic started making sense. What happens if the debt keeps growing, I asked. Then whoever owns the company deals with the consequences. And if that's Daniel, Linda simply raised one eyebrow. For the first time since this whole situation started, a very clear thought crossed my mind. Daniel believed he was the smart one in this marriage. He handled the construction deals. He negotiated contracts. He made the big financial decisions. If he asked for the company during a divorce, he would probably assume he was taking the most valuable asset. Linda seemed to read the same thought on my face. I'm not telling you to do anything yet, she said carefully. But if your husband decides he wants everything— She paused for a second. Sometimes the most powerful move is letting him have exactly what he asked for. I drove home from Linda's office with the windows down, even though the air was colder than I expected. My mind kept replaying the same sentence. Assets and liabilities travel together. For almost 20 years, I had believed the company was the most valuable thing Daniel and I owned. The house mattered, sure. Our savings mattered. But the company was the engine that powered everything else. Now I wasn't so sure. When I pulled into the driveway, Daniel's truck was already there. The garage light was on, and I could hear him moving tools around inside. For a moment, I sat in the car again, watching him through the open garage door. He looked completely normal. No sign of the secrets I had started uncovering. No sign that anything in our marriage was about to change. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the garage. "Hey," I said. Daniel glanced up from the workbench. "Hey." He wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the counter. "Long day?" he asked. "Something like that." For a few seconds we stood there in the quiet garage, surrounded by shelves of tools and old project materials Daniel had collected over the years. Then he said something that made Linda's conversation feel suddenly very real. "We should probably talk about something," he said. I waited. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck the way he always did when he was about to say something uncomfortable. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he continued, "about the future." I kept my voice neutral. "Okay, I don't think this marriage is working anymore." There it was. No dramatic build-up, no emotional speech, just a sentence delivered like he was announcing a change in the weather. "I've met someone," he added. That part didn't surprise me. "Ashley?" I asked. Daniel's head snapped up. "How do you know her name?" "I've been paying attention." He looked uncomfortable for about 2 seconds, then shrugged, like the secrecy no longer mattered. "Yeah," he said. "Ashley." For the next 10 minutes, he explained the situation the way people often do when they're trying to make a difficult decision sound reasonable. He talked about growing apart, about wanting something different in life, about how the relationship with Ashley had made him realize he wasn't happy anymore. What he didn't mention was the late nights, the hidden payments, or the credit line that was quietly expanding in the background. Eventually, he reached the part that mattered to him most. "I want to handle this like adults," he said. "No messy court fights." "That sounds good," I replied. Relief crossed his face. "I'm glad you see it that way." Then he started outlining the divorce terms he had already imagined. "I'd like to keep the company," he said first. Of course he did. "It's my work," he continued. "It makes sense." I nodded slowly. "Okay." He blinked, clearly surprised that I hadn't argued. "And the house," he added carefully. "Since the business is tied to this area, it would be easier if I stayed here." "All right." Now he looked genuinely confused. "You're okay with that?" I kept my tone calm. "What exactly are you offering in exchange?" Daniel shifted his weight. "You can keep the savings account and the retirement fund." Compared to the value of the house and the company, that wasn't much. But I remembered Linda's words. "Let him believe he's winning." "Fine," I said. Daniel stared at me for a moment like he was trying to figure out if I was serious. "Really?" "Yes." Over the next few weeks, the lawyers handled the paperwork. Daniel stayed confident the entire time. He told friends we had managed one of the most civilized divorces anyone he knew had seen. By the time the final hearing arrived at the courthouse in DuPage County, he looked like a man who had successfully negotiated the best deal of his life. And when the judge asked if I agreed to transfer full ownership of the house and Lawson Urban Development to Daniel Lawson, I signed the documents without hesitation. Daniel was still smiling when we walked out of that courtroom. You could see it in the way he shook hands with his lawyer, the way he held the folder with the signed documents like it contained a winning lottery ticket. In his mind, the math was simple. He kept the house. He kept the company. He walked away with everything that looked valuable. For a few weeks after the divorce, life was strangely quiet. I moved into a smaller townhouse not far from where Ethan had grown up. It wasn't fancy, but it was peaceful. No construction trucks in the driveway. No late-night phone calls from subcontractors. No tension sitting across the dinner table. Daniel, on the other hand, stayed busy running the empire he believed he had secured. But business problems don't disappear just because a divorce decree is signed. Within a few months, the credit line that had already been climbing continued to grow. Suppliers started asking for faster payments. Subcontractors began demanding deposits before starting new jobs. The projects Daniel had been counting on to stabilize the company didn't move forward the way he expected. Construction financing is unforgiving. When debt stacks up faster than contracts, the numbers eventually stop cooperating. About 8 months after the divorce, I heard from someone who used to work for the company. Lawson Urban Development had started letting employees go. Not long after that, the house went on the market. I didn't feel the victory people sometimes expect in stories like this. There was no celebration, no dramatic moment where I stood across from Daniel and said, "I told you so." The truth is, real life rarely works that way. What I felt instead was relief. Relief that I had stepped away from a situation that could have pulled me under financially. Relief that I listened to someone experienced enough to see the warning signs before they became my problem. The biggest lesson from all of this wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity. When a relationship starts breaking down emotions, make it very easy to fight over the wrong things. Houses, businesses, money, pride. People spend thousands of dollars in court trying to prove they deserve more than the other person. But sometimes the smartest move isn't fighting harder. Sometimes the smartest move is understanding the full picture before you decide what's actually worth keeping. That's something I wish more people understood when they find themselves living through family drama. In a lot of family revenge stories and revenge stories you hear online, the ending is dramatic and loud. Someone gets exposed. Someone loses everything overnight and the story ends with applause. Real life is quieter than that. Real life is about decisions. It's about paying attention when things stop adding up. It's about asking questions before emotions take control of the situation. And sometimes, it's about letting someone walk away with exactly what they demanded, because you already know the truth they're ignoring. If you enjoy real stories about family drama, complicated marriages, and the unexpected ways people rebuild their lives after betrayal, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We share new family revenge stories and revenge stories every week, stories that show how people survive betrayal, navigate difficult divorces, and eventually build a better life on the other side. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destroying someone else. It's simply refusing to let their mistakes become your future.